Will you state your full name, please?
Jose Maria Luna.
And what is your occupation?
Self-proclaimed expert on niche subjects.
Mr. Luna, you are here before the Problematic Activities Committee regarding an accusation about one of these subjects.
Yes, sir.
Please proceed.
So, in March 2022, the Florida legislature passed House Bill 1557, Parental Rights in Education, nicknamed the Don't Say Gay Bill. Governor of Florida and human trash Ron DeSantis signed the bill into law on March 28, 2022, effectively prohibiting classroom instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity from kindergarten to grade 3 in Florida public school districts. The law was widely and correctly seen called for the Walt Disney Company to speak out against the bill in an effort to stop it. At 17,000 employees, the Walt Disney World Resort in Florida is the largest single-site employer in the United States. In 2019, an Oxford economics study concluded they annually contribute an estimated $75.2 billion to the state's economy. In theory, they could have sufficient political capital to take significant action against the bill. Disney also has a long-standing informal relationship with the LGBT+ community, which includes a not insignificant amount of their employees. This turned speaking out into a moral imperative. After the worst weeks of CEO Bob Chapek's life, a public relations nightmare of half-assed statements of neutrality, employee walkouts, and angry quote tweets, the company gradually began to condemn the bill. Growing backlash eventually got the company to stop donations to the bill's sponsors and formally denounce it. Because bullying works. In response, conservative politicians started claiming that the company was embracing woke ideology, calling for it to focus on entertainment and stay out of politics. People on Twitter immediately mobbed these statements, claiming the company had never been apolitical, for Walt Disney was an outspoken conservative all his life. They cite all sorts of examples, such as the Disney animators strike, a Nazi propagandist visit to the studio, involvement with the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, and, most famously, Walt Disney's testimony against communism before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
I've heard enough. Sounds problematic to me.
Not so fast, Your Honor.
I beg your pardon?
As a self-proclaimed expert on this man, I believe that a lot of these statements do not tell the whole story. This is a rather incomplete political portrait that potentially misunderstands Walt Disney's impact on American society. Yeah, that's right. I'm gonna gatekeep. How could Walt be spinning on his grave, huh? He was cremated! Checkmate! So how political was Walt Disney? Was he really the conservative figurehead that people claim that he was? What were this man's politics? And, most importantly, do they still influence the world's largest entertainment company to this day? Part 1. Who was Walt Disney? How do I even begin to explain Walt Disney? Walt Disney is flawless. He has a 1/8 scale live steam locomotive and his own trestle. I hear he's making new cartoons. In South America, his favorite song is Feed the Birds. One time he met Richard Nixon on a monorail, and he kidnapped him. One time he fired me for unionizing. It was illegal. It's difficult to summarize a man who, at first, might seem like just a film producer, but who also dealt with television, theme parks, technology, diplomacy, and even urban planning. Walter Elias Disney was born in 1901 in...
By God, are you starting when he was born?
Sir, with all due respect, I read all these books for a reason. Walter Elias Disney was born in 1901 in Chicago to Elias Disney, a poor failed farmer turned carpenter, and Flora Disney, a school teacher. When Walt was 4 years old, his family would move to Marceline, Missouri. He spent some of the most formative years of his childhood in Marceline, gaining an appreciation for simple rural life. But this was no conservative Missouri town. In the words of biographer Neil Gabler, however it may have looked like the archetype of hidebound agrarian America, Marceline was not especially conservative. With its large workforce, it was a hotbed of support for the Democratic populist William Jennings Bryan, and it prided itself on its progressivism, which allowed young Walt to receive his cultural education here. He'd miss his life dearly when, at age 10, his family left the farm and moved to Kansas City. He was miserable there for a variety of reasons, mostly concerning poverty and child abuse. An interest in both film and drawing, as well as a desire to seek an escape from this life, led him to start a cartoon studio at age 20. At Laugh-O-Gram Studio, him and his partner Ub Iwerks pioneered animation while battling hardship and poverty. After going bankrupt, he would move to Los Angeles and start a new studio with his brother Roy Disney. They would quickly develop a good reputation for quality animation and big hits. The Disney studio became a mecca for artists, thanks to their ambitious projects and groundbreaking techniques. In spite of this, though, they were in consistent financial struggle. The studio expanded, pioneering television, theme parks, and a variety of other fields that interested Walt Disney. Most importantly, he built a bunch of trains.
Mr. Luna, how is this relevant?
Sir, Walt Disney loved trains. We can't possibly talk about Walt Disney without talking about the train. Although practically universally beloved during his lifetime, he's become a polarizing figure in the nearly 6 decades since his death, both culturally and politically. You have diehard fans who herald him as the epitome of inspirational figures, as well as incisive critics who accuse him of watering down culture and packaging it for profit. We'll attempt to examine these claims and to assess their validity, but that will not be easy, which is why we're going to explore this in 3 different stages: his politics, his beliefs, and his work. But before we do that, I want to make it clear that this is not meant to be some sort of apologia to justify questionable behavior, nor is it a condemnation that discredits any sort of positive contributions. This is merely an attempt to understand the politics of a man who was much more interesting and much more complex than either his unwavering fans or his ardent detractors would lead you to believe. Part 2. Walt Disney's Politics. In order to discuss Walt Disney's politics, we have to start by the way in which he was raised. And as we saw earlier, Marceline, Missouri, that town where he said most important things that happened to him happened, was a very progressive small town. Elias Disney himself was a self-described socialist who voted for socialist candidates, subscribed to socialist publications, and was even a founding member of the American Society of Equity, a farmers' union. This makes sense though, since the family was very poor and the American working class had still not been bombarded with anti-communist propaganda like they would later in the 20th century. Also, Elias' constant professional failures made the faults in the system all the more evident. He raised his children frugally and austerely, forcing them to work from a very early age. Walt Disney himself had to work in order to help provide for the family, most notably by working a paper route starting at age 9 once the family moved to Kansas City. The harsh working conditions he had to endure during these routes, as well as the physical abuse at the hands of Elias, were deeply traumatic and would haunt him for life.
You best be quick there, Walt. You better get those newspapers up on that porch and under that storm door. Pop's gonna lose his temper again and show you the buckle end of his belt, boy.
The abuse that he suffered at the hands of Elias would actually lead him to rebel against his father in a lot of different ways. Elias was sour and practical, while Walt was jovial and artistic. Says Neil Gabler in his biography, Walt Disney was the antithesis of Elias Disney, almost as if he had willed himself to be so as a form of rebellion, which he very well might have been. This contrarianism predisposed him against the socialist talking points that Elias Disney often weaponized against his children.
Is this your excuse, Mr. Luna, that the subject was literally neurodivergent and a minor?
Of course not, Your Honor, because the beliefs arguably remained there to some capacity. There was no major opposition to the ideology itself. In a letter that Roy Disney wrote to his parents in regard to socialist candidate Upton Sinclair, he said, "Many of the things he advocated for are going to come around in some form or another. However, I don't believe you can upset society overnight. I can hear they sing a different tune." Well, of course, it's true. From their point of view, Elias's beliefs had always kept them in poverty, while their own approach had finally gotten them stability. Additionally, Walt Disney claimed that when he was a kid, a gang of Irish kids whose parents worked for the Democrat political machine poured hot tar on his scrotum because Elias was a socialist, an incident which he claimed turned him into a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. If this seems overly simplistic, it's because it is. Throughout the first half of his life, Walt Disney consistently referred to himself as apolitical. Other than openly voting for Franklin Delano Roosevelt for president, he did not take any sort of particular political stand. That, of course, changed in 1941 when discontented studio employees looking to unionize started the infamous Disney Animators strike, which, don't worry, we'll take a better look at later. But for now, what's important to know is that Gunther Lessing, the lawyer who advised Walt throughout the strike, convinced him that this was a matter of communists trying to take over the studio. Maintaining this narrative, he stands firmly against the strikers and condemns commies. Following the strike, which he, by all intents and purposes, lost, he appears more conservative in public. He even testifies before the House Un-American Activities Committee against some of his former animators. This was an initiative from the United States House of Representatives in order to investigate disloyalty and subversive activities on the part of citizens suspected to have either communist or fascist ties. One of these things is not like the other. Walt showed up and claimed there was no longer communist activity in the studio, but that there was at some point. He denounced some of the labor organizers involved with the strike, and then called communism un-American.
I don't believe it's a political party. I believe it's an un-American thing. And I feel that they really ought to be smoked out and shown up for what they are, so that all the good free causes in this country, all the liberalisms that really are American, can go out without this taint of communism. That's my sincere feelings on it.
Mere hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Army forcefully occupies the Walt Disney Studio. Under these circumstances, and with the studio in deep financial trouble, Walt agrees to produce propaganda films for the government.
In Hollywood, Walt Disney has turned over almost the entire facilities of his studio for the production of Army and Navy instructional films.
Let's go with Navy Project 648.
Now, these shouldn't be really taken as political statements due to the coercive nature of the deal, but let's just say that the ones meant for the public were anti-fascist, while the ones meant for the military were pro-military. The 50s saw the birth of the Uncle Walt persona introduced in the Disneyland television show. This was the birth of the Walt Disney as a public figure. A comforting presence and talented storyteller, he seemed to become emblematic of 50s conservatism, American exceptionalism, traditional values, and revisionist history. He would certainly follow up on the Republican label by donating to a few Republican candidacies later in life, although he didn't really make a habit out of this. I'm not even smoking, and the smoke is making my sore throat, my throat sore. The simultaneous growth of the small independent studio into a large hierarchical structure and cultural force reflects a capitalist transformation, and Epcot, the project he was conceiving on his deathbed, almost seemed like the epitome of company towns, communities where practically all housing and businesses are owned by the one company that is also the main employer. These have more often than not been considered highly exploitative. But was this the image that he had of himself? He was once quoted later in life by saying, "They say I'm a conservative." My Walt Disney sounds more like Barack Obama. "They say I'm a conservative, but I considered myself a true liberal." Now, this is probably as complete a political portrait as we can make of a man who often rejected political involvement until the end of his life. But political statements don't really tell us the whole story. Part 3. Walt Disney's Beliefs. Now, as I mentioned before, Walt Disney was raised as a socialist, but he formally rejected that label out of distaste for his father. However, the values didn't entirely go away, especially because he didn't receive any other sort of political education. Throughout its first 17-ish years, the Walt Disney Studios were known for the very unique way in which they were ran. While other Hollywood studios had strict hierarchies and very formal environments, Disney was closer to, an alternative art college, then to Warner Brothers. Throughout his life, Walt Disney remained very down to earth, but this was particularly true of the early studio years. He was the boss, sure, but the atmosphere was very collegial. It was in these early days of the studio that Walt was frequently quoted as being in support of socialist ideals. Studio writer Joe Grant said, before the strike, Walt thought socialism was all about everybody pulling together. And the studio did operate as such. In times of financial trouble, for example, the studio would pay everyone else before paying Walt and Roy. He valued work, but he didn't see the studio as working for him, but rather for a common goal. Walt was right there in the trenches with everybody else, working hard even beyond office hours, for the love of the craft rather than to make money. He once said, "I don't make movies to make money, I make money to make movies." On one occasion, when complimented on the way the studio was run, he said it was like some sort of Jesus Christ communism. These pre-strike days, however, were not without controversy, some of which still haunts his own legacy to this day. An often cited event is Nazi propagandist Leni Riefenstahl's visit to the Disney studio in 1938, before the start of World War II. Her visit to Los Angeles was met with a boycott on the part of major Hollywood studios, which is why her visit to the Disney lot is seen as a sign of sympathizing. In truth, she wasn't actually invited. It was dancer Jace Jowitz, an acquaintance of Walt's, who asked him to give her a tour since she considered him the greatest personage in American films. He did, as a favor, show her around. He declined to sit down to watch her film Olympia, fearing that it might be taken as a sign of support, and, months later, disavowed her visit, claiming he didn't know much about her. Now, whether or not some sort of indicator of his personal beliefs. After all, Sergei Eisenstein, famed Soviet filmmaker and propagandist, was also invited to the studio, this time by Walt's own insistence. Said Sergei Eisenstein of Walt Disney that he seemed to know all the most secret strands of human thought, images, ideals, feelings, and that the work of this master is the greatest contribution of the American people to art. During the war and even after the animator strike, which we will get to, leftist organizations continuously sought his support because they perceived some sort of solidarity with their cause, and there was solidarity, such as when he served as a patron for the Congress of American-Soviet Friendship and sponsored a tribute to Art Young, a famous socialist cartoonist. He was a guest of honor at a Night of the Americas event in 1943, which was organized by the Council for Pan-American Democracy, a leftist Latin American organization deemed as subversive by the Department of Justice. This event, as well as the Art Young tribute, would literally place Walt Disney on an FBI watch list, questioning his loyalty to the American government.
Your boyfriend reads the Daily Worker? What is he, a communist?
He reads everything, you know. Ned's very well read.
Maybe he's just very well read.
At the same time, however, he was also becoming a member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, which, as the name might tell you, was a conservative group intending to defend the film industry and the country against perceived communist and fascist infiltration. It's worth noting that when the Los Angeles Communist Party condemned the actions of the MPA, they specifically spared Walt Disney because they admired his Latin American goodwill tour, which meant to prevent fascist expansion in the region. The organization supplied plenty of witnesses to the House Un-American Activities Committee, including Walt Disney, as we saw earlier. However, he would soon quit the organization over its support for a motion calling Writers Guild members to sign a loyalty oath against communism. Interesting development though, since it shows us that he wasn't really keen on participating on a communist witch hunt. So why did he name names when it came to his own studio? We are going to put a pin on that, because his association with the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals is also the source for a very specific claim. Tangent. Was Walt Disney anti-Semitic, racist, sexist, etc.? The MPA was often rightfully accused of harboring some of the most raging anti-Semites in Hollywood, which tainted the organization itself. This is often used as a basis for the claim that Walt Disney was anti-Semitic himself. However, no one actually ever accused him of such, not even strike leader Art Babbitt, who was Jewish and hated Walt Disney. The Walt Disney Studio had multitudes of high-ranking Jewish employees, none of which ever went on record to claim attacks on the part of Walt.
Ah, yes, the famous "he had Jewish friends" defense.
No, sir, not at all. I mean, to call Walt Disney an ally to the Jewish community would certainly be a stretch, especially because he didn't seem particularly concerned about the anti-Semitism in the MPA. However, the Sherman Brothers, the studio's beloved songwriting duo, said that Walt defended them from anti-Semitic attacks by one of the studio's lawyers, and he was named Man of the Year by the Beverly Hills Lodge of the B'nai B'rith organization for exemplifying the best tenets of American citizenship and intergroup understanding. Now, on the other hand, we have issues of race and gender. As a white man in the United States, especially during the first half of the 20th century, one could not, in good conscience, say that Walt Disney was not racist or sexist. For its first few decades, the studio was, save for a few Asian and Asian American animators, pretty much all white, and it wasn't until the hiring of Floyd Norman in 1956 that there was any long-term black animator at the studio. Floyd Norman, who is still alive, has continuously said that Walt Disney did not care about his race.
Now, people said Walt had these attitudes because he was a Midwesterner and he wasn't used to minorities. And they have these preconceived notions that Walt was anti-Semitic. They had thoughts that he was racist, but that wasn't true. And I can, as I told Walt's daughter, Diane, I can attest to this because I was there.
But similarly to how Imagineer Bob Gurr said that Walt didn't care that he was gay, we can't mistake everyday interactions for anti-bigotry. The fact that it took 30 years for there to be a black animator at the studio speaks to a systemic bias, even if unconscious. The studio had a significant percentage of women working there, and Walt was a man who respected women and often celebrated and saw himself in them. However, he often failed to stop workplace sexual harassment and relegated women to the ink and paint department for the first 2 decades of the studio. Having good intentions is nice, sure, but translating them into action is actually more important. Which finally takes us to part 4, the Disney Animator Strike. Okay, so the reason that I'm dreading having to talk about the strike is that it was an insanely complicated event, and while most people do get the right idea out of it, that it was good, there is still a bit of a lack of context for it. Because it's important to understand that, from where Walt saw it, the strike was a lot more emotional than political. For a much more detailed look into the strike, please check out the Funkland's video about it. It is brilliant, but here's the summary. Broadly speaking, the strike was partly a result of the economic hardships caused by World War II. These were revealing a lot of existing problems in the city Walt had splurged on that many considered cold and unwelcoming. That collegiate spirit of the early days was gone. There wasn't enough money to pay everyone at the studio. Layoffs were imminent. So discontent grew, and the Screen Cartoonist Guild courted the studio employees for them to join the union. As Walt tried to figure out what to do about this, studio lawyer Gunther Lessing got in his ear with the fear of communist infiltration. It's important to know that Walt and the studio had an extensive history of having had to fight off several attempts of takeovers in the past. In 1927, producer Charles Mintz had tried to strong-arm Walt into selling the studio by holding the rights to his then signature character, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, hostage. A few years later, businessman Pat Powers would try to do something similar with Mickey Mouse royalties. Both times, these men successfully lured away Disney artists with empty promises. And so, Lessing's fervent rhetoric fed into Walt's fear of losing the one community he had known. To him, this seemed like yet one more attempt to take over the studio, this time on the part of the Screen Cartoonist Guild. To counter growing union sentiment, Walt decided to gather the studio to give a speech that went famously horribly wrong. In the 20 years I've spent in this business, I've weathered many storms. It's been far from easy sailing. It required a great deal of work, struggle, determination, competence, faith, and above all, unselfishness. Some people think we have a class distinction in the place. They wonder why some people get better seats in the theater than others. They wonder why some men get spaces in the parking lot and others don't. I have always felt, and always will feel, that the men that contribute most to the organization should, out of respect alone, enjoy some privileges. My first recommendation to the lot of you is this: put your own house in order. You can't accomplish a damn thing by sitting around and waiting to be told everything. If you're not progressing as you should, instead of grumbling and growling, do something about it. At this point, Walt was ready to concede to the Union as long as a secret ballot was cast in order to confirm a majority. The SCG refused to do this, correctly claiming that they already had a majority, and then they gave him a few more days in order to recognize them, or else a strike would be called. In one last attempt to stop this, Walt decides to fire Art Babbitt, the strike organizer, breaking federal law in the process. The next day, the strike begins. The strike itself was very messy, with Walt even hiring former police officers in order to guard the studio when things looked like they could get violent. He almost jokingly, threatened to beat up Art Babbitt and drive his car into the protesters. He didn't actually do this, but he pretended he was going to. Walt insisted that he was ready to recognize the Union if a ballot was cast, but he was beginning to see that conceding was going to be inevitable. Meanwhile, Gunter Lessing kept fostering resentment. Walt felt betrayed. Said Neil Gabler on Walt Disney, The Triumph of American Imagination, it hurt him, because guys he had trusted were letting him down. Finally, the government intervened, a deal was struck, strikers received back pay, and fair layoffs were arranged in proportionate amounts. The remaining employees all got raises. Walt had wanted the studio to be a family, but it seemed like he modeled it on his own. This emotional investment in the strike's outcome, but almost complete indifference to communism outside of it, leads me to believe that this wasn't an ideological issue at all. He named the studio's union organizers before the House Un-American Activities Committee out of what seems like personal disappointment and a revenge impulse. Arguably one of the worst things he ever did, but is it necessarily indicative of his ideology? As quoted in Neil Gabler's book, Walt saw himself as benevolent, and he thought that after he had kept nearly everyone on the payroll, even during a depression, the angry workers were ingrates for calling a strike just because he demanded a secret ballot. It made no sense to him that they were chafing over a few relatively minor grievances. While his actions during the strike were reprehensible and a clear case of union busting, I don't think they tell us much about his general ideological tendencies. But either way, I'd argue that being an artist, Walt Disney's politics and beliefs don't even matter that much, at least not in regards to my point. What really matters is his work. Part 5. Walt's work. In the mid-20th century, Italian philosopher and cultural critic Umberto Eco traveled across the United States as part of his research on imitation and simulacra. This, of course, involved a visit to Disneyland. In an essay titled City of Robots that you can find in the compilation Travels in Hyperreality, he writes that if America is the country of the Guggenheim Museum or the new skyscrapers of Manhattan, then Disneyland is a curious exception and American intellectuals are quite right to refuse to go there. But if America is what we have seen over the course of our trip, then Disneyland is its Sistine Chapel, and the hyperrealists of the art galleries are only the timid voyeurs of an immense and continuous found object. Essentially, it seems like Disneyland, as well as Disney in general, simultaneously informs and reflects American culture. Few people influenced American history and identity as much as Walt Disney did, especially in such a tangible way. But he didn't think of himself that way. Towards the end of his life, in 1961, he expressed sadness and regret over not making art that mattered after watching To Kill a Mockingbird. That one was a hell of a picture, he said. That's the kind of film I wish I could make. There was a clear yearning to make more serious art than his usual fare. Of course, Song of the South, an earlier attempt of his to make some kind of political statement, had been clumsily handled, and it rightfully saw its fair share of backlash. The movie was intended to have egalitarian racial messaging, as well as regard for African American folklore.
Uncle Remus, his Songs and Sayings, published in 1881, met with instant success and gave the people outside the South their first knowledge of these beloved animal legends told on the plantations by the old Negro storytellers who had been handing them down
from generation to generation.
However, it approached it through a very limited lens, centering a wide perspective, recycling harmful stereotypes, and underplaying the horrors of slavery in the Reconstruction South. Think of it as The Help or a Green Book in its time. The NAACP, among other organizations, boycotted the film because of this, but Walt defended the film, successfully campaigning for star James Basket's Might Be Rare. There are still political overtones to most of his work. In his book From Walt to Woodstock, How Walt Disney Created the Counterculture, journalist Douglas were key in setting up the stage for the countercultural movements of the 60s and 70s. Be good, in the most conventional sense of that admonition, as a close analysis of any one film authority, and when, if, finding it invalid, to strike it against those who had, after all, also suspected authority and often questioned it, hated money and its acquisition, was wary of materialism, detested affectation, and came to believe fervently in internationalism. And all of these values had found their way into his movies and, quite possibly, into the minds explicitly and implicitly encouraged imagination on the part of the audience. The live action and various combinations thereof that demonstrate a sense of thematic continuity and a concept of Mary Poppins, which is also a very personal project for him. It is, at its heart, a bittersweet story about personal frustrations with capitalism and the emptiness of a corporate society. Any sort of real joy, one can see exhaustion from the never-ending nature of work.
Like sand through a sieve. And all too soon they've up and grown as too light for you to give.
And in his love for the song Feed the Birds, there's an anxiety about not doing enough good for others.
Though her words are simple and few, listen, listen, she's calling to you.
You can see here, but also in a lot of his other work, that there is an acknowledgement of capitalism as evil, or at the very least, unnatural. However, that political stubbornness holds back potential answers beyond individual reform. In Disney, nothing is more reprehensible than self-interest, particularly raw capitalism. Even the finest among us are tempted by living within the American system. Yet Walt will not, like his socialist father, simplistically condemn that system. Instead, Walt Disney insists on the need to redeem the corrupted American dream through an individual's difficult relearning of how to act in an honorable way. This is parallel to the reason why Marxist filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein was such an admirer of Walt Disney's work. He considered it a respite from the suffering of capitalism. Brave defiance to it, even. Gray, gray, gray. From birth to death, gray squares of city blocks, gray prison cells of city streets, gray faces of endless street crowds, the gray, empty eyes of those who are forever at the mercy of a pitiless procession of laws not of their own making, laws that divide up the soul, feelings, thoughts, just as the carcasses of pigs are dismembered by the conveyor belts of Chicago slaughterhouses, and the separate pieces of cars are assembled into mechanical organisms by Ford's conveyor belts. That's why Disney's films blaze with color. We run into what is often said about Walt Disney's work, that it provides escape, but I don't think that's the entire story. Sure, as Sergei Eisenstein said, Disney provides relief from inhospitable reality, but as Neil Gabler put it, Walt Disney, more than any other American artist, defined the terms of wish fulfillment, and demonstrated on a grand scale to his fellow Americans, and ultimately the entire world, how one could be empowered by fantasy, how one could learn, in effect, to live within one's own illusions, and even to transform the world into those illusions. More than anything, Walt provided the promise of control over one's own reality, a challenge to the existing order. He's enamored with the idea that a person such as himself can exercise control in defiance to powerful systems. The call is not to change these, but rather to grow beyond them.
So which one is it then? Was Mr. Disney a Republican, a neo-lib, a fascist, or a commie?
Well, Mr. Chairman, if Disney's so capitalist, why so many trains? Part 6. The Artifice of American Liberalism. This video is not meant to be a defense of a controversial man who's been dead for nearly 60 years. Nor is it supposed to be an attack on someone whose work and legacy still mean a lot to a lot of people, myself included. Rather, I would like to use this as an opportunity to discuss the different ways in which our ideologies are shaped by our circumstances and our experiences, and why continuously challenging them is so important. Walt Disney used to say that he saw himself in Cinderella, specifically in transformation through one's own power. He said that she believed in dreams all right, but she also believed in doing something about them. When Prince Charming didn't come along, she went over to the palace and got him. This makes sense since that's what he did. He had to work tirelessly as a child, he left a household where he was physically and emotionally abused, and he made a life for himself from scratch. However, he failed to consider that not everyone can do that. The systems he was often so frustrated by did not allow everyone to challenge them the way that he did. This self-proclaimed political ignorance of his led to him misunderstanding his own role as an exception, not the rule, and that surface-level predisposition against the left in name certainly didn't help. It honestly reminds me of a sentiment that I've seen expressed a lot on social media, that a lot of people in the United States, specifically in the working class, already hold socialist ideas but are not really aware of it because of the ignorance and pervasive propaganda against it. It was those two things that made Walt Disney turn to anti-communism when the strike hit. But if we take a look at the ideological journey throughout his life, we find a fluctuating set of values that are constantly growing and changing. There was controversy, for example, because of a scene in the short film Three Little Pigs over the big bad wolf pretending to be a Jewish peddler. The director of the American Jewish Congress wrote to Walt condemning the portrayal, to which he replied that Jewish animators worked on the short and that they were inspired by similar jokes from Jewish comedians. I don't know, I'm not Jewish, but that doesn't sound like a great excuse. Still, when the short was re-released years later, the scene was reanimated, and honestly, thank God. Even the anti-communism didn't really make it past the 40s. Artist Herb Reitman recalled that someone thought they could do damage to one of the writers on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by telling Walt that the writer was a Red. They thought that Walt would fire him or investigate him or kick him off the picture. Well, Walt's answer was, "I'm glad to know that. It's a relief that he's a communist. I thought he was an alcoholic." Easy mistake to make. As the studio grew, women got to branch out within the company into traditionally masculine jobs. Meanwhile, as broad covers, his work communicated a lot of succinct leftist values that directly contradicted the conservative idea that a lot of people had of him. So it would be wrong, in my opinion, to confidently call Walt Disney a conservative figurehead. I, in fact, agree with him when he said that he considers himself a true liberal, specifically because he's guilty of the same tendencies that I see in American liberals today. Whatever progressive values that Walt Disney had always existed within a corporate landscape. The company only got bigger until it was very easy for his successors to turn it into a conglomerate.
We don't need to bring Eisner into this. Obviously, Michael Eisner is a compassionate and progressive individual. This isn't about him.
So just like with the social liberalism that continues to operate within the Democrat base of the country, there is an inevitable clash between those ideals and the system that the party is intent on maintaining. Why? Think of what we've been led to believe feminism, queer acceptance, and racial equality look like. Franchise protagonists, mainstream products, marginalized politicians. Our problems can be reformed. Vote blue no matter who.
Is just the party platform. It's like a to-do list of things we're not gonna do.
The white man, said Malcolm X, will try to satisfy us with symbolic victories rather than economic equity and real justice. There's an illusion, American liberalism has a somewhat delusional grasp on optics, on the artifice of aligning one's politics to aesthetics that believe in a just system, while at the same time, those ideals exposed it as flawed. Let's go back to Umberto Eco's thesis about Disneyland. And if in the wax museums wax is not flesh, in Disneyland, when rocks are involved, they are rock, and water is water, and a baobab, when there is a fake hippopotamus, dinosaur, sea serpent. It is not so much because it wouldn't be possible to have the real equivalent, but because the public is meant to admire the perfection of the fake and its obedience to the program. In this sense, Disneyland not only produces illusion, but, in confessing it, stimulates the desire for it. Can't help but feel that the pomp and circumstance of the American system is both producing and confessing that same illusion, and both sides are equally guilty of believing in it. I mean, if anything, the conservative discourse of smaller government is much more honest about its own part in it. Claiming Walt Disney was some sort of conservative figurehead kind of absolves liberals from indulging in his same illusions. Just like with him, we have to ask ourselves, how valuable are progressive values when they are still confined to the capitalist inner workings of a corporation or a system? And is it possible to really make a lasting positive impact when your institution, your company, or your party maintain the system that creates the need for a positive impact in the first place?
Very impressive, Luna. Good job.
Thank you.
Now, please tell us what you know about Mr. Robert Chapek.
Oh God, no. I would like to have a job someday.